The night before Aaron died, he and I shared a grilled cheese sandwich. This is one of his favorite foods, as probably many of you know. There weren't that many of those favorite foods. It was a really good grilled cheese sandwich. He was really happy about it. A week before he died, we woke up one morning and he said, "We really need to talk about Bayesian statistics." And I said, "Right now, it's Sunday morning, it's like 7 a.m., can it wait?" And he said, "No, it's really important." And we spent the next couple hours working through a naughty Bayesian statistics problem. He'd already asked the internet with no useful responses. I have the notes. We ended up with a naughty double integral that neither of us could solve. But if anybody here wants to help me with the solution, let me know. He was really excited the last couple months. He was working on a drug policy research with a friend of his, Matt Stoller, for GiveWell. And he would read these articles, all the academic literature, talk to the experts. He got really into this one particular study about an intervention that had been tried in Hawaii for alcoholism. Controlled tests indicated that it got 90% of alcoholics dry in the first month. And he just was so bubbling over with excitement about all of it. We went to Burlington, Vermont over New Year's. He got the flu, but he came out and played Mafia one evening with the friends that we rented a house with, and I was really surprised because he didn't like playing games at all. But Ada, Danny's daughter, was there with us, and he really wanted to see what would happen if Ada was the Mafia. And unfortunately, nobody selected Ada as the Mafia, which Ada was really annoyed about. But one of the things that I loved about Aaron was the sheer number and variety and multitude of wonderful, fascinating people who animated his life. I had the great privilege of sharing that life with him for the last 20 months. But I know that I only met a small fraction of the people whose lives he touched. And that's why I came out here today, was because I know that many of you were important to him. And I wanted to meet you. And I want to tell you the stories, like the stories I just told, because I think it's really important that his friends, his family, his colleagues, his admirers know that he had a lot to live for, and that he had a lot of happy moments in those last few weeks and months. I'm also here with another message. Aaron's death should radicalize us. The trial and the case hung over our entire relationship. We started dating a few weeks before he was indicted, a couple months after he had been arrested. I met his parents for the first time at 12:30 a.m. the night before the indictment and spent 5 hours with them in the courthouse the next day. They didn't know I existed before that, so that was an interesting first meeting. He hadn't told me what was going on when we first started dating. All I knew that there was something bad happening in his life and that I was a good distraction from it. He called it the bad thing, and I had wild speculation about what it might be. My leading candidate theory at one point was that he was having an affair with Elizabeth Warren and was going to ruin her career. He called me one night when I was at Frisbee practice in D.C., and he was in Boston, and he said, "The bad thing might be in the news tomorrow. Do you want to hear what it is from me, or do you want to read about it in the news?" And I said, "I want to hear from you." And he said, "Well, I've been arrested for downloading too many academic journal articles, and they're trying to make an example out of me." And I said, "Well, that doesn't actually sound like a very big deal." And he paused for a second, and he said, "Yeah, I guess it's not like anybody has cancer." In the end, it kind of was like that. The only time I was ever really worried about him before the last week was when he was trying to decide whether to accept the plea bargain. the whole thing was so hard and so stressful, and he carried so much of the weight of it on his own. He didn't want to involve any of his friends. He wanted to protect people, but he wasn't very good at protecting himself. I went to Boston with him last month in December for a hearing, and the trial got the judge granted another evidentiary hearing about whether evidence should be admitted, and the trial was delayed for another couple of months. And he came out of the courthouse, and I tried to give him a courtroom. I tried to give him a hug, and he pushed me away. He said, "Not in front of Hyman, not in front of Steve Hyman, the prosecutor." He said, "I don't want to show him that. I don't want to show him any vulnerability." I think Aaron made the wrong choice 2 weeks ago. I think the odds were decent at the trial, and I think even if he hadn't won, that life still was worth living. But I think he woke up 2 years after this ordeal started, and I think he just couldn't face another day of the stress, the uncertainty, the lack of control over his own destiny. Aaron's death should radicalize us. And I mean that specifically about us, about you if you're here in this room or if you're watching this online. Aaron died because of deep injustice in this world. Aaron loved to talk about the 5 whys of the Toyota management system. And so I'm going to ask why. Why did Aaron die? Aaron died in part because we live in a system where the constitutional rights we've all come to believe in through civics classes and through watching Law and Order don't actually apply in the real world. There's no right to a speedy trial. It had been 2 years since Aaron was arrested. We still didn't have all the evidence that the government still hadn't turned over all of the evidence to us, that they were constitutionally required to do so. Why does that happen? In part, it's because the system is so clogged up with cases and has so few human resources. It takes years for practically anybody who actually wants to go to trial to find out whether they're guilty from a jury of their peers. It takes them years because the system is so clogged up and so under-resourced with drug cases and with, the senseless overcrowding of our criminal justice system. Prosecutors aren't used to going to trial. Last year, only 3% of all federal charges were taken to trial. Most of the rest were resolved in plea bargaining. Plea bargaining processes give prosecutors enormous amounts of power. Imagine being totally innocent of any crime and not having the resources that Aaron had at his disposal and the networks and the support. Many people feel they have no choice but to accept a plea bargain. They can't afford lawyers for 2 years. And you could say in some sense that Aaron's death was caused by the war on drugs. He wasn't a victim directly, but he was a casualty of that war that's aimed actually at quite different people from Aaron. Aaron's death should radicalize us. He died because of a prosecutor and a U.S. attorney who had immense individual power over his life and were more interested in making a high-profile example out of Aaron than in justice or in mercy. Why did they do it? In the case of the prosecutor, Steve Hyman, the best theory I can offer is that he's simply a vindictive old man who really doesn't like young upstart whippersnappers like Aaron who are trying to save the world. Hyman's the kind of guy who wants to claim a notch on his belt and high-five other prosecutors at lunch. But we have to follow the whys. Why does this man have the power to ruin the life of someone like Aaron? We can trace the problem to tough-on-crime initiatives that have systematically transferred power from the hands of judges to prosecutors. We can trace it to punitive sentencing guidelines and ambiguous, overreaching laws like the CFAA that give prosecutors the power to charge someone with decades in prison for a victimless crime. In the case of Carmen Ortiz, the U.S. attorney who's Hyman's boss, Aaron's case was a stepping stone to higher political ambitions. Ortiz wanted to be a judge or a governor or a senator someday. She probably still wants to be. And unfortunately, in our society, one of the well-trodden paths to elected office is through the prosecutor's office. That means that from mayor's offices to Congress, leaders are disproportionately people who've made their name in being tough on crime. They're people who spent the bulk of their career trying to lock people up. They're people whose job it is to be punitive and not just or merciful. That's how we end up with these kinds of laws to begin with. They're people who embody a legal system that locks up more than 25% of the prisoners in the world when we have only 3% of the world's population. Why do we vote for these people? Why do we provide them with the incentives we do? Why do we as a country applaud and reward them and build structures around them as they lock up more than 1/3 of the black men in our country? Aaron's death should radicalize us because he's probably the first person that most people in this room have ever met who got swept up by this system. But there are literally millions of others whose lives are destroyed in this country. And Aaron would have been the last person who would want us to fetishize his experiences or to treat him as exceptional. In response to Aaron's death, I and his family are calling for 5 things. First, Steve Hyman and Carmen Ortiz must be held accountable. Second, MIT has lost its way and it must find it again. MIT could have saved Aaron with a single public statement and it refused. Third, all academic research from all time should be made openly accessible to anyone with an internet connection. Fourth, we have to amend the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act to prevent prosecutors from these kinds of overreaches. And fifth, we have to reform a criminal justice system where we incarcerate millions of people and prosecutors throw the book at someone like Aaron, but not a single banker has gone to prison since the financial crisis. Aaron's death should radicalize us, but Aaron's life should also radicalize us in a very different way. One of Aaron's favorite shows was Louie. And there's an episode, and I'm going to do my best Louie impression, which probably isn't very good. There's an episode where Louie gives a little stand-up routine. I drive an Infiniti. That's really evil. There are people who just starve to death. That's all they ever did. There are people who are like born and go, I'm hungry. Then they die, and that's all they ever got to do. Meanwhile, I'm driving in my car, having a great time, and I sleep like a baby. It's totally my fault. Because I could trade my Infiniti in for any other car, and I'd get back like $20,000, and I could save hundreds of people from dying of starvation with that money. And every day, I don't do it. Every day, I make them die with my car. Aaron loved that routine, and he realized something when we watched it together. He realized that Louie copied this bit right out of Peter Singer. This is a Peter Singer essay as a comedy routine. Peter Singer was one of Aaron's favorite philosophers, and he's a really uncomfortable philosopher. A lot of people don't like thinking about Peter Singer. Here's why. Let's say you knew that you had the power to change a law that would save innocent people's lives, maybe stopping a carcinogen from polluting groundwater near a town. Let's say you knew it would save 10 people's lives, and you chose to do something else instead. Something that didn't have much bearing or impact on the world. Are you culpable? Peter Singer would say yes. Most of us studiously avoid answering that question, because the truth is we're faced with questions like, should we trade in our Infiniti or should we work on the carcinogen every day? It's really hard to live your life thinking about that. But Aaron's life should radicalize us. Aaron lived a Singerian life more than anyone else I've ever met. Aaron had money. We all know he could have had a lot more if he had tried. But he lived out of backpacks and he stayed on people's couches. Sometimes, I'll admit, it went a little too far. Like the time we'd been dating for a few months and we were meeting up in Boston, and it was his responsibility to find us a place to stay. He thought that an air mattress on his brother Noah's bathroom floor was perfectly sufficient. But I respected him for it. He didn't buy an Infiniti. He didn't get a nice apartment. When he died, he left his estate primarily to give well, probably the most Singerian of all charities. But living a life of personal austerity and charity isn't enough. Aaron felt responsible not just for the direct costs of his lifestyle, but for the opportunity costs. He felt responsible for the carcinogens he wasn't stopping. Here in Silicon Valley, The idea of changing the world is no mirage. You see examples all around you every day of people who've changed the world. And Aaron was one of those people. But the question is, how are they changing the world? Facebook has changed the world, sure. But is the world better off because of Facebook? And even more importantly, if you're deciding whether to take a job at Facebook, is that the place in the world where you can do the most good? Aaron wanted to do the most good. He wanted to apply the lean startup framework to impact. He was learning and iterating. He thought we all needed to think both bigger and smaller. He said to a few of my friends once, "The revolution will be A/B tested." That's what he was trying to do. So I'm here to ask the hard questions today. If you're not already working to change the criminal justice system in the U.S., what are you working on? Is it more important than that? It might be. There are more important things. There are places where you can have more impact. But there are so many ways, so many things that need to be changed about this world. Which one of them are you working on? Aaron's death should radicalize us, and his life should radicalize us. Fact is, we live in a world in which very few people we know pay the ultimate price for their political beliefs. We live in a world in which very few people we know even suffer serious life-altering consequences for their political beliefs. But we live in a runaway global political economy that's taking people's lives every day. Aaron wasn't trying to become a martyr when he downloaded those JSTOR articles, but he was taking a risk on behalf of the billions of people around the world who grew up without his privilege. More of us need to do that. There's so many ways to have impact, so many ways to help people. Aaron had an exchange with David Siegel, who runs Demand Progress, the group that he founded, that many of you know from the SOPA fight. Aaron loved recounting this conversation. David called him one night and said to Aaron, "Remember that year when we defeated SOPA, got indefinite detention ruled unconstitutional, and got both political parties to incorporate internet freedom into their platforms at the conventions?" That was Aaron, David Siegel, and a couple other people. They did all that in 1 year. Everybody here is capable of that kind of change. There are so many places in our world where that kind of change can happen just from having somebody there, somebody paying attention, somebody pushing. If you're a programmer or a technologist, like many of you in the audience today, you have special powers and special responsibilities. I went to a talk once that Aaron gave where he spoke to maybe a couple dozen people, like the people in this room, to programmers who he was trying to convince to work in politics. And he told them, "You can do magic." Aaron really could do magic. And I'm dedicated to making sure that his magic doesn't end with his death. I hope you'll join me.